to imagine a more appropriate choice to deliver a lecture named for the late Edward Said than Noam Chomsky. The careers of both men combine the most meticulous scholarship and political passion and personal courage. Both have stood as the conscience of an intellectual world that far too often succumbs to the temptations of power, of the powerful. Like Said, Chomsky is not afraid to say the unpopular thing, to point out that many emperors have no clothes, to project alternatives when the media and political leaders say that no other course is possible, and to think of what may be rather than what is. This is why, for students, scholars, and political activists around the world, both Said and Chomsky have served as a source of inspiration. There's a story that in the 1970s, the Prime Minister of Italy gathered a group of intellectuals and pleaded with them to help solve one of that country's periodic crises. I think it was Umberto Eco who rose and responded, "Mr. Prime Minister, the role of intellectuals is not to solve crises, it is to create crises." Let us hope that Noam Chomsky continues to create crises for those in power for many years to come. So, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome the Edward Said lecturer, Noam Chomsky.
When I was a young teenager and my father was getting a little nervous about some of the directions I was pursuing, he did mention to me that he had been a member of the IWW, and I was sort of curious, so I asked him why he joined the IWW. And he said when he came over on steerage as an immigrant, I was working in a sweatshop in Baltimore, barely knew any English. He said a guy came around and was trying to sign people up. He couldn't understand what he was saying, but he seemed to be for the workers, so he signed up. I don't think they have that in Wikipedia. Well, to the subject. I think that the greatest singular achievement of Said as a literary critic has been to put imperialism at the center of Western civilization. And what you find in both historical, political literature and literary works in the West in the last 400 years is a great emphasis on the role of enlightenment in the making of civilization and its discourse. You find a great deal of emphasis on rationalism, on democracy, on democratic values, and on liberalism as an aspect of enlightenment. There's an almost remarkable tendency to not mention imperialism as shaping the contours of Western civilization in literary criticism and historical writing. There are two times, before Said's Orientalism and after Orientalism. Well, I've been quoting the assessment of Edward Said's literary contributions by his close friend and comrade in struggle, Iqbal Ahmed. He was like Edward, he was a rare and stellar example of an engaged intellectual dedicated to truth and justice in word and in action. Their passing a few years ago is an irreparable loss for the poor and the suffering of the world, and also for depth and clarity of thought and understanding. Among Edward's many achievements was to draw the culture of imperialism out of the shadows and explore its deep roots and its pervasive implications in many domains. And in these remarks, I'd like to explore some of its specific manifestations, focusing on the events that opened the way to the famous Unipolar Moment of unchallenged U.S. global hegemony 20 years ago. I was interested to see the pictures on the wall as I came in, remembering those moments, and also the ways in which these events are remembered on the 20th anniversary, which was celebrated last month. To do so requires following two tracks. One is policy, and the other is its interpretation through the prism of imperial ideology. And the dawn of the unipolar moment is a very instructive test case, I think, in both domains. We can gain a sense of how deep are the roots of imperial ideology by considering completely unambiguous cases. None are more clear than horrendous crimes that were frankly acknowledged by the perpetrators, but passed over as insignificant or even denied in retrospect by the beneficiaries, namely us. Settler colonialism, which is commonly the most vicious form of imperial conquest, provides quite graphic illustrations. The English colonists in North America had no doubts about what they were doing. Revolutionary War hero General Henry Knox, the first Secretary of War in the newly liberated American colonies, he described, I'm quoting, the utter extirpation of all the Indians in most populous parts of the Union by means more destructive to the Indian natives than the conduct of the conquerors of Mexico and Peru, which would have been no small feat. In his later years, after his own contributions to these crimes were long past, John Quincy Adams lamented the fate of what he called that hapless race of Native Americans, which we are exterminating with such merciless and perfidious cruelty among the heinous sins of this nation, for which I believe God will one day bring it to judgment. There were some who offered a more comforting refrain, among them Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story, who wondered at the mysterious ways of Providence, which in its wisdom caused the natives to disappear like the withered leaves of autumn, even though the colonists had constantly respected them. Distinguished contemporary commentators reinterpret the wisdom of Providence in secular terms. One example is the prominent Yale historian John Lewis Gaddis, the sort of dean of Cold War historians. He hails Adams, John Quincy Adams, as the grand strategist who laid the foundations for the Bush Doctrine. The doctrine that, as Gaddis puts it, expansion is the path to security. It was a very convenient doctrine for those who can get away with it or have powerful patrons. With evident appreciation, Gaddis observes that the doctrine has routinely applied throughout the history of the infant empire, as George Washington termed the new republic. He passes in silence over Adams's gory contributions to the heinous sins of this nation as he established the doctrine in a famous state paper justifying the conquest of Florida on utterly fraudulent pretexts of self-defense. The conquest was part of Adams's project of removing or eliminating Native Americans from the Southeast. It's William Earl Weeks, the leading historian of the massacre, who provides a lurid account of what he calls this exhibition of murder and plunder, targeting lawless Indians and runaway slaves. Gaddis cites Weeks, but spares us the content of what he said. To mention an even more extreme example, just a few months ago, in the New York Review of Books, political analyst Russell Baker describes what he learned from the work of the heroic historian, as he calls him, Edmund Morgan. Namely, here's what he learned, that Columbus found a continental vastness sparsely populated by farming and hunting people. In the limitless and unspoiled world, stretching from tropical jungle to the frozen north, there may have been scarcely more than 1 million inhabitants. I looked carefully. No letters appeared in reaction, though a few months later the editors did publish what they called a clarification, which stated that in North America, recent research suggests that the numbers may have been as high as 18 million. Well, the clarification is perhaps even more telling than the original. Baker, first of all, was not referring to North America, rather from tropical jungle to the frozen north. The research is not recent. It's decades old. And it was also known a long time ago that the sparsely populated, unspoiled world included advanced civilizations, also in what's now the United States. Nevertheless, the exercise of genocide denial with a vengeance merits little concern or comment, presumably because it's so unremarkable and in a good cause. Now, not all cases of genocide denial get such an easy pass, and the criterion is not very difficult to discern. The European Union recently approved what they called a framework decision on combating racism and xenophobia, which bans publicly condoning, denying, or grossly trivializing crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. Putting aside the question of whether the holy state should be granted the right to determine historical truth and punish the deviation from its edicts, what's of particular interest here is the selectivity of concerns. There was a response among historians who were upset about it. They feared that the framework decision might bar not only questions about the Holocaust, which is already banned in many countries, but also inquiry into crimes of the Ottoman Empire and Stalinist Russia. Well, perhaps other cases come to mind, perhaps with Western powers as perpetrators and beneficiaries, but that question didn't arise. To this day, the United States is reverentially admired, at home at least, as a city on a hill, or as Ronald Reagan preferred, a shining city on a hill. Last April, British historian Geoffrey Hodgson was admonished by New York Times columnist Roger Cohen for describing the United States as just one great but imperfect country among others. Hodgson's error, Cohen explained in the New York Times, is his failure to realize that unlike all other states, past and present, America was born as an idea, as a city on a hill, an inspirational notion that resides deep in the American psyche. So its crimes are only unfortunate lapses that do not tarnish the essential nobility of America's transcendent purpose. I'm borrowing the phrase of the eminent scholar Hans Morgenthau, one of the founders of the hard-headed realist school of international relations, expounding on what he called the purpose of America. The inspirational phrase, city on a hill, was coined by John Winthrop in 1630, outlining the glorious future of a new nation ordained by God. 1 year earlier, his Massachusetts Bay Colony had received its charter from the King of England, and it established its Great Seal. The seal is worth looking at. I think it ought to be on the wall of every classroom in the country. It depicts an Indian with a scroll coming from his mouth, pleading, "Come over and help us." The charter states that rescuing the population from their bitter pagan fate is the principal end of this plantation. So the English colonists were guided by what Obama's UN ambassador, Susan Rice, calls the emerging international norm that recognizes the responsibility to protect innocent civilians. The colonists were thus on a humane mission as they extirpated and exterminated the natives for their own good, as their successors explained. So President Theodore Roosevelt orated that the expansion of the peoples of white or European blood during the last 4 centuries has been fraught with lasting benefit to most of the peoples already dwelling in the lands over which the expansion took place, despite what Africans or Native Americans or Filipinos or other beneficiaries might mistakenly believe. This venerable conception, which is still very much alive and in fact operative, it's been guided in part by the providentialism that has so deeply influenced American culture from the early settlers up to George W. Bush. In his case, there's some pretty remarkable examples. This is the conception that we're carrying out God's will in his mysterious ways. That's been accompanied by another thesis, also venerable, also very much alive, the thesis of Anglo-Saxon superiority, which traces back to the original Aryans and the Teutons in the German forests, who maintained their racial purity by exterminating those in their paths. They then crossed the channel, did their work, and then came over here, which is why we're a city on the hill. These beliefs are deeply ingrained in English cultural history, and they carried over to the infant empire established by the English in those limitless and unspoiled world that they found. For the founder of American anthropology, Lewis Morgan, the Aryan family represents the central stream of progress because it produced the highest type of mankind and because it has proved its intrinsic superiority by gradually assuming control of the earth. Charles Darwin endorsed the view that the history of the culture of mind from Greece to the Roman Empire and onward only appears to have purpose and value when viewed in connection with, or rather as subsidiary to, the great stream of Anglo-Saxon emigration to the West, and finally to the United States, where the advance of civilization has reached its peak because the nation produced the greatest number of highly intellectual, energetic, brave, patriotic, and benevolent men. As the project was approaching its final stages, final success in the mid-19th century, the governor of California, Peter Burnett, informed the public that the war of extermination will continue to be waged between the two races until the Indian race becomes extinct. The inevitable destiny of the white race is beyond the power and wisdom of man to avert. Only the Lord understands it. The progressive national poet Walt Whitman saw the course of history in a similar way. Our conquests, he declared, take off the shackles that prevent men the even chance of being happy and good. On the conquest of half of Mexico, he asked rhetorically, what has miserable, inefficient Mexico to do with the great mission of peopling the New World with a noble race? Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote that it's very certain that the strong British race, which has now overrun much of this continent, must also overrun Texas and Mexico and Oregon also, and it will be in the course of ages of small import by what particular occasions and methods it was done. It's easy to go on, but examples are really quite unfair because the ideas have been conventional. In fact, they're almost universal. It's hard to find exceptions. There's some. And approaching the present, very few eyebrows were raised, as far as I could see, when a leading scholarly history of U.S. diplomacy, this is 1969, commented wittily that after liberating themselves from British rule, the United Colonies were able to concentrate on the task of felling trees and Indians and of rounding out their national borders. It's liberal scholar Thomas Bailey, one of the standard histories of American diplomacy. Well, it's important to recognize that after the civilizing effect of the activism of the 60s, such words are no longer acceptable, although there's a long way to go. Well, with these inadequate words of background, let's turn to the present on the double track of policy and ideology, beginning with the latter, with ideology. So let's begin with the month of November 2009. That was marked by the joyous 20th anniversary celebration of what British historian Timothy Garton Ash calls the biggest year in world history since 1945, which changed everything, thanks primarily to Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms within Russia and his breathtaking renunciation of the use of force, a luminous example of the importance of the individual in history, leading to the fairly open Russian elections of March 1989 and culminating in the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, which opened the way to liberation of Eastern Europe from Russian tyranny. That's what's celebrated on the pictures as you walk in. The general mood was captured rather well by a British barrister, Matthew Ryder, writing in the London Observer. He spoke for what he called the Niners. That's the generation that's now providing global leadership, Barack Obama in their lead, and their conception of history was shaped by a world changed without guns in 1989, events that gave them confidence in the power of dedication to nonviolence and justice. That's today's global leaders. These accolades for November 9th are deserved, and the events are indeed memorable, and the picture is even compelling, which is why it's virtually 100% of commentary, as you can check for yourselves. It's compelling as long as we keep rigorously to a dominant principle of imperial culture. We must focus laser-like on the crimes of enemies and on our own high-minded condemnation of the crimes of enemies. But crucially, we must make sure never to look at ourselves. And the principles apply in the familiar way to the events of last November. And some alternative perspectives, mostly unintended, may be instructive. One was provided unintentionally by German Chancellor Angela Merkel, who called on all of us, quoting her, to use this invaluable gift of freedom to overcome the walls of our time. That's good advice, and we can easily follow it. One way to follow it would be to dismantle the massive wall, which dwarfs the Berlin Wall in scale and in length, which is snaking its way through Palestinian territory. Of course, in gross violation of international law, if anyone cares about such details. Well, like virtually every state action, this annexation wall, as it should be called, is justified in terms of security. That's a reflex, whatever a state does. But as is commonly the case, the claim lacks any credibility at all. If security were the concern, the wall would be built along the border, and it could be made completely impregnable. The purpose of this illegal monstrosity, which is constructed with decisive U.S. support and European complicity, is to allow Israel to take over valuable Palestinian land and the main water resources of the region. That's one part of a much broader annexation project which we fund and support. Otherwise, it couldn't continue. The highest Israeli authorities recognized from the outset that these programs were in direct violation of international law. There was never any ambiguity. It's leading legal authorities in Israel. But as Defense Minister Moshe Dayan commented in late 1967, settling Israelis in occupied territories contravenes, as is known, international conventions, but there's nothing essentially new in that, which is quite true, so the issue can be dismissed. At least it can be dismissed as long as the global hegemon provides diplomatic cover and the needed material and ideological support, and is therefore a co-partner in crime. Another perspective on the 2009 celebrations is provided by the leading scholar advocate of what's called democracy promotions. Thomas Carruthers, good scholar who writes from an insider's perspective. He served in these programs during the Reagan administration and regards himself as a kind of neo-Reaganite. After reviewing the record, Carruthers ruefully concludes that all U.S. leaders have been schizophrenic. They need some kind of psychiatric help. The schizophrenia is that they support democracy if and only if it conforms to strategic and economic objectives by some strange accident. Hence, they support it in Soviet satellites, but not in U.S. client states. These judgments were dramatically verified through the 1980s, period leading up to the fall of the wall. The fall of the wall has been rightly celebrated in recent weeks, but there's been little notice of what happened 1 week later, on November 16th, 1989. It's in El Salvador. That was the brutal assassination of 6 prominent Latin American intellectuals, Jesuit priests, along with their housekeeper, Julia Elba, and her daughter, Celine, by the elite Atlacatl battalion, armed and trained by Washington. The battalion had just returned from a several-month refresher course at the JFK Special Warfare School at Fort Bragg, and a few days before the murder, the battalion took part in a further training exercise run by U.S. Special Forces flown to El Salvador. The battalion is heralded as El Salvador's best. The battalion had already left a bloody trail of the usual victims during the horrendous decade of the 1980s, which opened in El Salvador with the assassination of Archbishop Oscar Romero, the voice for the voiceless, as he was called, by much the same hands. And the story was similar throughout Central America, leaving hundreds of thousands of corpses and general misery during a reign of torture, murder, and destruction, guided by the Reagan administration under the guise of the war on terror that they declared in 1981 as they came into office. Well, it was surmised at the time that the murder of the Jesuit intellectuals was planned by the high command of the Salvadoran army. And that was confirmed 2 weeks ago by the publication in the Spanish press of the document, the actual document ordering the murders and the murder of any witnesses. This was signed by the Chief of Staff and his associates. It's all in hand. All of them so closely connected to the Pentagon and the embassy, U.S. Embassy, that it's very hard to imagine that Washington was unaware. These dramatic discoveries have yet to be reported here, and I'm not anticipating that they will. Mainstream Spanish press, wire services, takes some competence to miss them. One can easily understand why the consciousness of the Niners was shaped by dedication to nonviolence and the power of idealism. Now, that's fair enough if attention is rigorously guided by the culture of imperialism, is focused on their crimes, with ours removed from sight and removed from memory. Now, the contrast through the 1980s between the liberation of Soviet satellites and the violent crushing of hope in U.S. domains is striking and instructive, but it becomes even more so when we broaden the perspective. The assassination of the Jesuit intellectuals was a crushing blow to liberation theology. That was the remarkable revival of Christianity that had its modern roots in the initiatives of Pope John XXIII and Vatican II, which he opened in 1962. It's an event that ushered in a new era in the history of the Catholic Church, quoting the distinguished theologian Hans Küng. Inspired by Vatican II, Latin American bishops adopted what they called the preferential option for the poor, renewing the radical pacifism of the Gospels that had been put to rest when the Emperor Constantine in the 4th century established Christianity as the religion of the Roman Empire. As Kung describes it, that instituted a revolution which converted the persecuted church to a persecuting church, as it has remained. In the post-Vatican II attempt to revive the Christianity of the pre-Roman period, priests, nuns, laypersons took the message of the Gospels to the poor and the persecuted, brought them together in base communities, encouraged them to take their fate into their own hands and to work together to try to overcome the misery of survival in the vicious realms of U.S. power. Well, the reaction to this grave heresy was not long in coming. In 1964, a military coup took place in Brazil. The basis was laid for it by the Kennedy administration, actually occurred a couple of weeks after his assassination. It established a national security state in Brazil, kind of a neo-Nazi national security state. It overthrew a mildly social democratic government, instituted a reign of torture and violence. It was the most decisive victory for freedom in the mid-20th century, according to Kennedy Johnson ambassador Lincoln Gordon, who added that the democratic forces now in charge should create a greatly improved climate for private investment. Gordon's words were echoed just a few days ago when Obama's ambassador to Honduras called the elections under the military regime a great celebration of democracy.